In 10th edition 40k, every army has at least some strength and some interesting units to put on the table, but in this video I thought we'd talk about their flaws. Let's talk through some of the greatest weaknesses of every single army in the game. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics for another more general 40k video. In this one we're going to talk through each army in the game and just run through a few of the things that they maybe do less well, weapons that tend to be efficient against them, and problems that they might have trying to achieve what they want to on the board. Some of these things might be genuine problems for the factions, some of them might just be about trying to make armies function differently. It does make sense that different factions would have strengths and weaknesses in game, and that does add a bit more flavour on the tabletop. Loads to talk about, so let's jump straight into it. We'll go through the Imperium, then Chaos, then Xenos. First up, for the boys in power armor, we have the Space Marines. Currently in terms of tournament win stats, one of the weaker armies in 40k unfortunately, a win rate of 42%. I feel like perhaps one of their weaknesses overall is that those stats are often lower than they might be otherwise. One of the problems is there's a lot of different ways to play Space Marines with lots of different chapters and unit variety, and that means that any one player might be kind of unlikely to have the absolute most optimal Space Marine list when Games Workshop inevitably changes the rules around every so often. And given the way that Games Workshop have set up the Space Marine chapters and detachment system, it often means that you might just get a lot more value out of a Space Marine army list if you play one of the divergent chapters. It does kind of feel that they're basically Marines Plus for the most part, getting the same or more character choices than all the Codex Space Marine chapters, plus having fun unique units that might or might not be competitive. Otherwise, for actual gameplay, they do tend to be maybe a bit more jack of all trades, master of none in some cases. Lots of units playing for melee ability and power armor, making them maybe a little bit more forgiving than some factions, but maybe does come at the price of a little bit of efficiency into given targets sometimes. Otherwise, they tend to be at least relatively elite, which doesn't make them as good for screening or putting things like horde units on the board. That's not really something that they do. And for things that will kill them, anything that's flat damage 2 or 3 generally tends to be a good pick, particularly things with higher AP weapons, reducing those power armor saves down to something negligible. And perhaps higher AP is doubly important with Armor of Contempt on the go. It can be pretty helpful for any abilities that either ignore modifiers or ignore cover as well on that front. For slightly underpowered units, maybe Tactical Marines and Reavers might stick out compared with the rest a bit more than most. Either of those just need a better ability boost or a points drop if that's not coming to compete against the myriad other Space Marine troops armed with bolters. And though Codex Space Marines does have good support for a bunch of different detachments, some certainly feel underwhelming. Anvil Siege Force just doesn't really tend to work very well on competitive tables with loads of dense terrain, and the First Company Task Force just doesn't really seem to be doing the business quite good enough for Terminator and Veteran sort of forces, just lacking a little bit of raw strength there. Before we move on to the rest of the armies of the Imperium, I thought I'd just talk briefly about Starforged, who chose to sponsor this video. I kind of rarely do video sponsors on Auspex Tactics, though I have featured their stuff a couple of times before. They're basically a luxury Warhammer 40k merch type site, officially partnered with Games Workshop and allowed to make some cool stuff, including perhaps one of their more surprising ranges in a range of Warhammer 40k jewelry and insignia type things. They asked me to specifically feature this rather snazzy silver inquisitorial ring inlaid with a garnet, something I wouldn't really bat an eyelid at if there was artwork depicting an in-universe Inquisitor wearing. Obviously these kind of jewelry and luxury merchandise sort of products aren't the sort of thing that's going to interest literally everybody, but it felt like enough of you might have at least some interest in these. They do have perhaps a surprisingly extensive range of faction-specific jewelries and accessories and things. They've got different designs for Sisters, Templars and the Imperial Guard. If you were a particularly dedicated fan of the Inquisition, you might be interested in this one, which is made of silver with a red garnet. The Inquisition one looks like it's $129 on their site, which I believe can ship globally, I think from Hong Kong. I feel like the rest of their site in general is maybe interesting enough to have a look over for gifts and things for people in the hobby that aren't just yet more miniatures to add to the pile of shame. In any case, I'll leave a link to them down in the video description, and of course a big thank you to them for sponsoring our video. Getting back to the subject at hand though, and before we move on to the rest of the Imperium, let's talk through the divergent chapters. I feel like they're kind of in an odd space to talk about in terms of weaknesses, given that they kind of add more to Space Marines in general, so they more sort of improve the faction in their own different ways. I feel like maybe it's a bit more helpful to talk about perhaps the bits that the armies don't do well, or their unique rules that don't see that much play. For the Blood Angels, I feel like the most prominent are the Sanguinary Guard. Certainly got an interesting enough datasheet, but just costed into the stratosphere so that nobody takes them in competitive lists, or at least not for the most part, being outweighed by Jump Intercessors or Death Company. Previously, I would have said that the Sons of Sanguinius detachment really wasn't holding its own, but since they upped it to +2 strength, that got a lot of important units to good breakpoints. Strength 6 Assault Intercessors on the charge or Strength 10 Death Company Power Fist are both pretty intimidating. It does come with its strengths and weaknesses compared with Gladius though. I'd say that lacking access to advance and charge is one of the weaker points. For the Dark Angels, they've unfortunately had a rather underwhelming codex release in my opinion. Lots of units getting nerfs and then not really getting the points cuts they needed for those nerfs to be reasonable. Pretty much all their unique stuff is at least borderline overcosted. Deathwing Knights were maybe okay efficiency but had their damage output reduced at the same points cost. Lionel Johnson I don't think went down enough to compensate him for losing that -1 to wound. The Landspeed of Vengeance and the Inner Circle Companions both really didn't do well out of the points changes. It is kind of weird that basically almost the entire index is pretty bad. And then there's just Grandmaster Azrael, who's almost auto-include strong for the 105 points between his great buffing rules and command point generation. Perhaps to the extent where it means that Dark Angels can actually punch above many of the rest of the Space Marine chapters, which often tends to be generic Space Marines centered around him. Otherwise, for the detachments, I feel like the Deathwing and Ravenwing ones at least have interest. They are dependent on their respective units being strong, though, to actually be worthwhile. I really felt like they missed a trick with the Unforgiven Task Force, though. I feel like it needed something Blood Angel style just to give it a nudge back into line with the rest of the Space Marine detachments. It does have some okay things, but the very weird called Battle Shock benefits just isn't really all that great. And despite being a very infrequent pick competitively beforehand, it arguably got worse not better in the Codex. Otherwise, for the Divergent chapters, we've got the Space Wolves. They definitely have some very strong data sheets, though I feel like maybe they're a little bit too focused on Thunderwolf Stormlance as their one way to do well. I think it's certainly a cool way to play them, though maybe it overshadows some of the other units they have in their roster. I feel like unlike the Blood Angels, the Champions of Rust's small boost that it got in the balanced data slate really wasn't enough to help them out properly. The core mechanic of that just remains far too swingy. The Sagas are great when they're active, and if you got lucky and were able to activate a lot of them early in the game, it could be really big. But there's going to be some games where it's just too dependent on your opponent to be able to access them, or some of them just won't be able to be done at all. Moving on from Space Wolves to Deathwatch, like this bloke here. They do feel like Games Workshop haven't really paid too much attention to them since the edition came out. Most of their mixed kill teams are just a little bit unfortunately overcosted. All their Primaris ones I don't think are quite where they need to be. Probably the most interesting thing that they have is the Proteus kill team for just an enormously threatening damage hammer. Can be good with some characters and detachment combos such as Gladius Fire Discipline even, but even then you have to hit enormously hard and the unit isn't really all that durable for the cost. It does mean that you could have a huge chunk of your army wiped out in return. For their unique detachment, some standard damage buffs are at least fairly easy to use. I think it does have some pretty interesting enhancements and the Teleportarium stratagem. Maybe it's just a bit unfortunate that 3 of their stratagems now solely revolve around bolter units, where Space Marine bolter shooting units just don't tend to be the most scary things they have damage-wise. They can be okay on some of the kill teams though, I guess. Finally, for the Divergent chapters, there's the Black Templars, who I feel like are in really quite a good spot relative to the rest of the Space Marines. It does seem that they're the competitive go-to out of any of these right now. Most of their data sheets are genuinely quite strong. I guess maybe just the standard Castellan and Marshall might be a little bit on the weaker side versus the generic equivalent within Codex Space Marines, though that's kind of a minor gripe really. The detachment also I think is pretty well done. Righteous Crusaders is strong enough to be played at the top levels of competitive play. Maybe the main thing that feels a bit odd for Black Templars is that Ironstorm Spearhead is one of their best ways to play as well, just solely due to the cheap multi-melters that they can tack on to big scary vehicles. I feel like plus 20 points for a multi-melter was far too much when the edition launched, now plus 5 is probably a bit too little. Maybe they should just make them a consistent 10 across the board. I feel like that could more accurately tie in with the extra value that they bring to the table. Moving on to the rest of the Imperium, and first up we have the Astra Militarum. They're an army with slightly lower win rate at 45%, they still seem to be doing well enough to top a few tournaments with the best players around, though the average player does seem to be really struggling. For weaknesses for the core guard rules, they are one of the armies that's a bit more susceptible to Battle Shock than most. They've got Leadership 7, and if they fail Battle Shock, then their orders cancel. The majority of factions don't have their core mechanic messed around with when they fail Battle Shock, so it can just get on a little bit worse against certain factions that play heavier on it, like Tyranids or Chaos Knights. Otherwise, for army capability things, they don't have a ton of melee, but Bulgarins are pretty nice as brawlers to hold down the front line. They don't tend to kill anything too enormously big and tough, so it could cause problems if the game unfolds that the guard could really do with killing something in melee. Their core detachment buff does feel a little bit flawed for the majority of the army if they want to try and make it general purpose. Born soldiers is just far more useful on artillery, as they're pretty much always going to be staying static, compared with the tanks and infantry that needs to rumble up to get to objectives or get lines of sight. For weapon profiles, they're good at killing them. Anything that's strength 4 to 6 and AP -1 will pretty much ruin their infantry, and then uncomplicated big high strength, high AP anti-tank things are unsurprisingly the go-to against Lehman Russes. They maybe have more things at the extremes than in between. For underpowered units, I'd actually argue that the vast majority of the Guard Codex is in a pretty playable space. Perhaps for some slightly less powerful examples, the Valkyrie, the Hydra, Deathstrike, and the Rough Riders could be one of the examples of things lesser played. Compared with several factions out there, though, I think it could be worse. Otherwise, for potential weaknesses, they often need to play smarter about tanks getting tagged in melee. You can still fire with big guns, never tire, but it can still cause big problems, like say if you needed other things to wipe out the unit that tagged your tank, screening is very important. Certain big units like Baneblades and Dawns, which are certainly okay for their points in my opinion, might struggle on certain tables with fitting through tight gaps in terrain, and I feel like as a faction they are maybe a little bit over-reliant on Lord Solar being a command bunker to dish out orders to everyone. If he ever winds up getting toned down a bit, then that's going to directly impact on the strength of the faction. Beyond all that, just with their tournament statistics and things, it does look like they're a very high skill faction. An army that's going to underwhelm just for raw power, but if you can choose the exact right decisions to make with your movement and application of indirect fire, it does seem that they can go from good to great. Next up for the Imperial Knights, they're kind of mid-strength in 40k right now, win rates around about 49%. Knights, given that they're a big army full of super heavy walkers and big vehicles, are maybe one of the armies that have the most obvious strengths and weaknesses. Namely, if they run into an enemy army that's just got lethal hits or massive anti-tank guns in abundance, they're going to have bad times. And also anything that destroys big heavy targets in melee efficiently is going to be bad news for them, as they get invulnerable saves and rotate ion shields at range, but not in melee. Otherwise, for weaknesses, Knights struggle with moving around terrain and might get outplayed by infantry or potentially move blocked hard in early turns against the wrong opponents. They don't get scouting or infiltrating units built in to screen, and that could be a really big issue for them. Given that you're playing with quite so many big vehicles, you're usually not going to be able to hide everything from enemy firepower turn 1. It does mean that if the opponent's got some big scary anti-tank guns, you're going to lose some important stuff most likely. And within their core faction, they don't really have any particularly cheap units, the cheapest being things like Armiger Helverins at 140 points. They can pick up some smaller stuff from the Agents of the Imperium, maybe some Henchmen Warbands or a Calidus Assassin. Overall, I'd say that most of the classes of Knight are at least playable given their big rerolls and raw strength and heavy guns. Maybe the Knight Valiant feels like it's one of the most relatively underpowered ones, that one just having lost so much more compared with the rest when Knights were no longer able to overwatch. Otherwise, for perhaps some more higher end competitive games, there are maybe a slightly lower skill ceiling army. There's maybe not a crazy amount of nuance with marching a whole load of big scary war machines towards the enemy and hoping for the best. There's definitely ways that you could play them better and worse, but maybe not quite so much variance compared with other armies. If the opponent's threatening to take fixed secondaries as well, they might potentially give up Bring It Down really quite easily depending on the exact list. For the Sisters of Battle, the Nuns with Guns are doing fairly well at big tournaments at the moment, a win rate around about 52%, though in general they do tend to be an army that tends to do a bit better in competitive settings versus casual. They have quite a lot of units that are maybe fairly interesting damage dealers and can do some funky things with their Miracle Dice combos, but just don't tend to have all that much durability, and some of them don't have much speed either. It means that getting things left out in the open and exposed could lead to a lot of casualties very quickly, and are maybe a little bit more reliant on terrain for staying safe with their units as well, doing better on tournament setup boards where you've got lots of line of sight blocking. Otherwise, for some criticisms, their detachment rule is maybe a little bit scattergun. If your opponent focuses down units, then you might not get much benefit from the Hallowed Martyrs. And while Miracle Dice are pretty great, they can be swingy. I've certainly seen some games where Sisters players have just consistently rolled low Miracle Dice, and if you don't manage to net an average number of 6s, then you will lose a lot of power that way. Otherwise, for anti-tank, they can sometimes have issue with their multi-melters being slow and short-ranged. Castigators can add a bit of long-range firepower, but are kind of low AP. In general, low strength and high AP-ish weapons tend to do quite well against low toughness units in power armor, and maybe for units that are struggling more than most, perhaps the Celestian Sacrosancts might be one to single out a little. Most elite infantry that weren't getting played much got points decreases, but they seem to be passed over at the last balance update. For the cogboys of the Adeptus Mechanicus, they're struggling a bit in 40k right now, a win rate of 44%, and just in general, lots of people seeing their codex as having had a whole load of issues that kind of went the wrong way for what people were hoping for when their book got updated. For the most part, their units just tend to be very underwhelming in terms of actual damage dealers beyond Cataphron breaches potentially. Pretty well everything else tends to more fall in durable units that sort of get annoying and get in the way of the enemy, but don't really do much besides against lightish infantry. The Skitarii Hunter cohort tends to do significantly better than the other detachments, though the playstyle is one that maybe a lot of AdMech players don't really feel particularly enthused by. Doing things like storing big blocks of Taraxi around to move, block and be nuisances, and perhaps do the same with Dragoons, Iron Striders or Vanguard in transports. Another one of the most common gripes is that per the amount of money that you pay for the army, you generally get some very non-elite units. Lots of their most expensive elites tend to be falling in around about the 50 to 80 point sort of mark for 5 of them, which is very low indeed. Between being extraordinarily expensive to get on the table and taking a long time to paint up, it is also something that gives plenty of hobbyists a challenge. Lots of people aren't too enthused that their detachment role only affects range damage for the most part, not really melee stuff. And for other specific things, heavy bolters tend to be quite efficient into their 2-wound infantry with invulnerable saves, and for some of the most underpowered units, called the Castellan Robots and the Rust Stalkers might be some of the ones to talk about most, perhaps along with the Archaeopters. Overall, I feel like people might well be hoping for Games Workshop to take a real proper change of AdMech in the next balance update, make them generally more dangerous as an army. Even if it did mean that some units might have to pay for that with points rises, that would be preferred to yet more points cuts. For the Emperor's Golden Boys, there's the Adeptus Custodes. Currently they seem to be top tier in Warhammer 40k, a win rate of 56% and greater than the vast majority of the rest. Certainly a far cry from being as runaway standout as Aeldari early in 10th though. In general they are just very strong. I guess if you're looking for criticisms, they don't have an enormous amount of proper firepower units aside from allied Caladius tanks or perhaps Imperial Knights. They do tend to be rather slow and purposeful, slogging up the board in their golden armour to take the midfield, but that is kind of their playstyle in general. It does mean that the enemy might have the chance to outmaneuver them or play clever around them, and while you might have a lot of potential damage to unleash, you might not be able to catch the enemy when you most need to. Certain rules and characters can help with that, like Blade Champions getting you to advance and charge. Otherwise, they tend to be hyper-elite as an army. You can do a little bit of screening with Sisters of Silence, though most of the time your opponent's going to be able to alpha strike important units in your army. In general, they have to trust on their defensive profiles to carry them against that, and perhaps for faction capabilities, they don't have any access to infiltrate units to take the mid-board. Could sometimes lead to the chance of getting move blocked a bit early in the game against some foes. For weapons that are most likely to kill them, high strength and good AP with damage 3+ en masse tends to be the way to go. Small arms generally aren't that much use, and you're going to need to treat Custodes like they're walking tanks for the most part, and they've got good defense against devastating wounds and mortal wounds. For things that are underpowered for the rest of the army, the Virtus Praetors still seem to be undertuned relative to the rest, and most of their Forge World range is still a bit disappointing. Dreadnoughts in particular seem to be a bit overcosted, which is a shame given how cool they look. Overall though, it does seem that when you add everything together, they do seem to be one of the strongest armies in Warhammer 40k right now. Maybe one of their biggest weaknesses is they're likely to get toned down again in the next balance data slate. Fingers crossed Games Workshop can try and get them right this time, rather than either too strong as they were at the start of 10th, or too weak as they were after that. Moving on to the Imperial Hyper Elites, but this time in silver armour, we've got the Grey Knights. They seem to be doing really quite well after those Dread Knight changes, going up to a win rate of 51%. I feel like the Dread Knights have helped to mitigate the biggest weakness that they had, which was struggling to take down tough stuff. Anything with T10 or more gave those force weapons a challenge, but given that the Dread Knight Psy Cannons got to AP-2 and ignores cover, it does mean that they can threaten at least medium armour a whole load better. Otherwise, for weaknesses, they're very reliant on their teleport tricks to get value out of their units. It's really powerful to be able to warp units around the board, maybe do a 3-inch deep strike on some of them. but I feel like teleport tricks maybe only get you so far. You're still going to need some things to actually try and take and hold the points in the midfield, and you can't back out of every fight. And besides Caldor Drago, it's also a fairly unreliable way to deliver those force weapons to close combat, which tend to be stronger than their shooting. So I feel like it is quite good, but maybe has some diminishing returns and could run into some potentially big problems against armies that have got enough board presence to be all over the board, maybe hordes in particular. Having a fairly small unit roster as well does mean that they lack some tools for certain battlefield roles. They don't have infiltrate units or efficient long-range anti-tank at the moment. I guess technically they could if their Grey Knights Dreadnought was priced a bit better, though at the moment that one's one of the more overcosted things that they have. Otherwise, for enemy weapons, given their 2+ armor save and sort of mid-toughness profiles, enemy special weapons like plasma guns and melter guns tend to have unusually good value against them. Something with fairly high AP and damage 2 or 3 is likely going to be a sweet spot, maybe ignoring cover if possible. Anything that gets anti-psyker or other bonuses against witches is going to be a problem as well, given that every single unit gets the keyword, more or less. Overall though, they don't seem to be in a too bad spot, doing fairly well right now, and pretty much most of their core units playable. I'd say that their weaker things tend to be their flyers and the Dreadnought, a bit more of the generic Space Marine stuff there. Moving on to the Forces of Chaos, and we'll start out with the Chaos Space Marines. They're an army that's been nerfed really quite heavily, going from one of the strongest factions in the game to one of the single weakest. Looks like they're putting a borderline poor performance in at tournaments at win rates of 45%. Chaos Marines really did take a broad battery of nerfs to basically all their good stuff. Multiple strong stratagems toned down, multiple things went up in points or had small rules changes. I feel like a lot of their units are really now paying for the massive damage that the Dark Pacts can bring for them. It's kind of funny just how much the cost of the Forge Fiends has risen since the edition came out. Otherwise, for the Dark Pacts, you do have the risk of the Mortal Wound chip damage you're going to get every so often from it. Occasionally, that could just suddenly mean that an important unit goes down to being very easily to kill for your opponent. And I feel like to make the most out of your units, you do need to both lean into their pacts and also their stratagems, combining both to get some obscene damage output, as in general they tend to be skewed a lot more to damage than defense as an army. Most of their defensive profiles just aren't super standout for how much they cost, though as with Space Marines, most things that are multi-damage and have at least a bit of AP are going to do you well here. Maybe for standout underpowered units, Vashtor, the Lord Discordant, and the Helldrake I all feel are rather overcosted right now. For more mainline things, perhaps Havocs could use a small points drop, maybe not truly unusable, but seem to be rarely played competitively versus other options. Overall, again, with armies like Imperial Guard, they tend to be an army that's got really quite low win rates, and most people struggle with, but the occasional really good player does seem to be able to get them to top tournaments from time to time. They've certainly got a crazy amount of raw damage and some powerful tricks like hiding units from shooting. It's just going to be a puzzle to work out which ones to use when against each new opponent. Next up, for the Forces of Nurgle, we have the Death Guard, a pretty solid and well-balanced army at a win rate of around 49%. I feel like they're overall in a really good place, certainly challenging for top spots at tournaments, and the majority of their unit roster very usable. Again, they're an army that do have some fairly notable strengths and weaknesses. They tend to be really quite slow moving, and their damage output tends to be maybe a bit grindy and short-ranged. And that does tie in with their Contagions of Nurgle as well, giving you really quite good debuffs on the opponents, but only when you're up close, and the contagion range doesn't expand too much until later in the game. Within their unit pool, they do have some reliance on allied Nurglings at the moment for certain battlefield roles like dropping for secondaries or infiltrating screening. And perhaps if anything, weirdly for Nurgle, their durability maybe isn't quite as overwhelming and monstrous as it has been in ages past. Perhaps that feels like it's the case for Plague Marines in particular, given that their units can load up with all manner of fun special weapons, and it means that they can't really be too standout durable, otherwise they'd just be undercosted. Again, as with Space Marines, anything with good AP and damage 2 or damage 3 tends to do very well. For criticisms within their unit roster, I'd say the Blight Lord Terminators really stick out as a unit that just seems to be directly inferior to Death Shroud right now. I feel like they could probably use a points cut. And out of the Virion members, the Noxious Blightbringer and the Plague Surgeon maybe feel like they're overshadowed by the rest of the cast. For things that could counter them as well, anything that gets to just flat out ignore modifiers is going to be bad. It does mean that they could counter contagion type things from them, and that could cause some problems. For the followers of the Blood God, we have the World Eaters. Again, maybe somewhat like the Chaos Space Marines, they feel like an army that's been cut down from a fairly strong place to a somewhat weak one. a win rate of around about 45% at tournaments. They were doing at least fairly well prior to the data slates, but then the nerfs at least hit most of their strong stuff in one way or another. It does seem to have them struggling a bit more, given that they've got a very small, unique choice of units, and they didn't really have many other places to go besides the ones they were already fielding. World Eaters definitely have their own set playstyle. They like running at you with a big chain axe, and therefore have very limited shooting. They might be reliant on allied War Dog Brigands if they want this. Their playstyle often tends to revolve around getting a whole load of 8 bound to scout up the board and charge into you very hard turn 1, and things like enemy scouts or infiltrators could get in the way of that. If they're clattering against screening units and then maybe left out in the open after that, that could be bad times. As with the rest of the Space Marines, damage 2 or 3 profiles with a bit of AP will do well. They generally tend to have less good defense than their damage, given that they're pretty brutal in melee for the most part. And if they're caught out in the open, then they're going to take heavy casualties to any sort of efficient firepower. Though admittedly, anything that does survive is probably going to cause you some big pain. I feel like most of their units are maybe just a little bit overcosted from where they really want to be. Khan and Khorne Berserkers and 8 bound all feel like they could just use a small points decrease. I genuinely don't think it would have to be anything super major, just enough to maybe get another critical unit on the table perhaps. Otherwise, for weaknesses, Angron is all rather amazing, but you could have very big swings in the game as to whether or not Angron regenerates or doesn't. If he does, it could be game changing or winning, and if he doesn't, it could lose, so your hands are in the Blessings of Khorne dice gods there. Similarly, if you desperately need the +2 to movement and the advance and charge turn 1 to get some key charges off, if you happen not to roll those despite any rerolls, then again that could be a big deal determined by no more than luck. Finally, for the deity-specific legions, we've got the Thousand Suns representing for Tzeentch. Again, they seem to be doing rather well in tournaments and things, a win rate of around about 51%, though I feel like they've got a reputation for being a trickier army to play than most, generally a faction that tends to do a bit better in the hands of really high-skilled players versus people who are newer to the game. There's lots of big choices to be made, such as where to spend those Kabbalistic ritual points, particularly when you've got huge options like massive damage debuffs on the enemy, spamming out mortal wounds, or big things like a double move which could be crazy when applied to certain threatening units, Magnus the Red in particular. Speaking of which, Magnus tends to be the competitive heart of Thousand Suns list at the moment. Kind of cool to see the Primarch being quite so strong. He is a model that needs kind of careful play though. You can't really afford to get him killed too early. If you do, that could lose the game, but also if you're too cagey with him and don't get the value out of that massive points investment, the opponent might get too far ahead and he just might not have enough value out of those points that you paid for him. Otherwise, for the rest of their battle line, they tend to be at least fairly slow moving without certain movement tricks like those double movement or the Umbrellific Crystal. Their other units tend to be a bit better against bullying enemy infantry versus heavy tanks, not really a whole load of ranged anti-tank besides Magnus himself. Their units tend to revolve around rubrics led by sorcerers, and it means that any damage 2 or 3 weapons again are pretty great here, and any weapons that affect psychers in specific again are going to have a really good time. They're also an army that might give up the assassinate fixed objective rather easily too, given their big abundance of characters. Otherwise, for underpowered units, I'd say that Zangors and Scarab Occult Terminators tend to be kind of underused at the moment. I feel like maybe some very small points decreased on these could be okay, though at the same time I feel like you wouldn't want to go too far, given that having the Rubric Marines at the heart of the army does feel very appropriate. Overall, I feel like in a fairly good place, certainly able to do well at tournaments, though might need some clever schemes and forward planning to get you there. Next up, for the Spiky Knights, the Chaos Knights are fairly well balanced right now, a 50% win rate, even if the way that they do so is often using mass War Dogs there, which I think is a criticism that quite a lot of players have. It would be a bit better if more of the big knights were a little bit more balanced with the little guys. As with the Imperial Knights, they do have kind of similar strengths and weaknesses, lots of big, easier to command units, but having a huge amount of vehicles are hard to hide from enemy firepower. If the enemy's got loads of lethal hits or high power anti-tank weapons, then they're going to go down more easily, and particularly anti-tank in combat where they don't get invulnerable saves. They don't have any cheap units in the roster, though you can rely on some allied Nurglings for some infiltrate and secondary objective work. And compared with the Imperial Knights, they maybe struggle just a little bit less with terrain, given that they have that walk through wall stratagem. Though even with that, I'd still consider it a weakness. Compared with the Imperials, the Chaos Knights have their Battle Shock shenanigans rather than just some raw damage and defense bonuses. It does have some interesting abilities, and it's one of the armies that makes Battle Shock work best, I think, though it is going to affect some factions better than most. It depends on the leadership of the army, plus whether or not you're likely to just kill units outright or leave them damaged. For weaker units, it still seems that despite the points adjustments, as mentioned, the War Dogs are a bit too dominant over the Titanic Knights. I've seen a few people using things like the Chaos Knight Lancer a bit, though War Dog still seems to be the default. Finally, as with the Imperials, they do give up the Bring It Down secondary very easily. Plus, the same as them, they're just a rather limited scope army. They'll just walk at you, just trying to coordinate some big stat lines and big guns into position. You can definitely play them well or better. They maybe just don't have quite as much scope for big clever tricks compared with some of the others. When they're at this sort of power level, they often tend to be an army that will do well against the majority of the field, but might not make it to the top tables of grand tournaments all that regularly. For the Denizens of the Warp, we have the Chaos Demons. Following some big points cuts in the last balanced data slates, their win rates improved a bit to a solid 50%. They're an army that plays very differently to the majority of other factions in Warhammer 40k, having big emphasis on their deep strike mechanics and warping into real space, plus kind of being a sort of fantasy army in space, which does mean that they have way more representation for melee combat compared with ranged attacks in their roster. Those deep strike and redeployment type tricks are maybe quite strong versus some armies, but a bit less so against others. Anything with just a ridiculous amount of board control like an enemy horde could give them problems, even if they can put some things within 3 inches or drop closer with the Shadow of Chaos. The Shadow of Chaos itself I think is alright as an army rule. It's maybe just a bit awkward in the times where you check when it affects though, as you have to have the mid-board objectives under your control at the start of the movement phase, which often might well not be the case, and that could mean that you might have a little bit less scope for close 6-inch range deep strike unless you've got Be'lakor along. As with the Chaos Knights as well, the Battle Shock shenanigans it brings are better against certain armies than others. Otherwise, for enemy weapons, big volumes of low AP attacks are going to tend to be the most efficient things against them, given that they get invulnerable saves, not armor saves, and that's also kind of a weakness with the very easy cover saves that you can get in 10th edition. Often demons just don't really care too much about getting cover at all, as they're going to be saving on their invulnerable save either way. Lethal hits and autocannons and things are probably not really what they want to see on the other side of the table. Overall, I feel like given they had so many points decreases, a lot more things went from being kind of bad to at least kind of playable. They still maybe feel like they need a lot of emphasis on their greater demons to be able to take down enemy tanks and heavies. And I feel like as an army, they've got quite a lot of bloat in the HQ section, many of which just don't really get picked that often at all. Perhaps out of other more battle-liney sort of units, the plague drones might be particularly singled out as a bit overcosted. It still feels like there's plenty of stuff that's just about usable, but also kind of so-so. There might be a bit of an element of functioning as 4 mini-armies within the same army might lead to a bit less synergy than some factions have. If you did want to have something with an area of effect buff, like say a Great Unclean one for Nurgle, it means that you only have quite a small roster of things that is actually going to affect, versus the big amount of choice in the rest of the index. Overall, certainly a very different army to play, and maybe can be a little bit trickier to grasp than some of the other armies, but sometimes that might be work out for the advantage, with other people not knowing quite how to react to them on the other side of the table. Moving on to the Xenos now, and first up we have the Aeldari. They're still holding fairly strong at a win rate around 51%, despite repeated multiple layers of nerfs to them ever since the edition came out. Their army power has certainly been greatly diminished since that point, though that's probably a good thing given how rampant they were. Fate dice are just a bit less of an important mechanic, given that they dropped down to only 6 of them following the nerf, and their devastating wound weapons aren't quite as overwhelmingly enormously brutal. For other disadvantages, they don't really have that many cheap expendable units to push on objectives, or really tough anvil sort of units to hold the mid-board and take some punishment. Maybe Wraithblades or the Avatar of Cain could do, though it's not something I'd call a strength of theirs. In general, besides those options as well, they don't really have many options for quality melee compared with their range damage. Often craft world lists tend to be a lot more shooty than close combat focused. For enemy weapons, any sort of mass strength 4 volume fire is going to be bad for them, and maybe particularly indirect fire that can hit things behind terrain. Lots of their fast-moving objective scoring units that tend to get taken really don't want to be hit by a bunch of mortar fire or something. For notably underpowered units, maybe Howling Banshees are particularly obvious as an aspect. I'd argue that most of their Harlequin and Corsair units are kind of rarely taken, and compared with a few factions in the game, it does feel like there's a few of their units that are costed as per their strongest loadout, say the support weapons with their D cannons or the Wraith Knights with the heavy D cannons. Overall though, they still seem to be doing okay, despite repeated batteries of nerfs since the edition came out. On competitive tables, they still seem to do really quite well, though again maybe feel like an army that now needs to be played with a lot more intelligence than they did, and they might not like tables with small amounts of line of sight blocking terrain. That could be bad news for a lot of their objective scoring interference units like Shadow Spectres, Warp Spiders and Swooping Hawks. For their sinister Dark Eldar cousins, again I'd also rate them as really quite strong in 40k right now, tournament wins around 50%. And with the Sky Splinter Assault Force coming in the last balanced data slate, they tend to be hitting very hard out of transports at the moment. For any weaknesses in their army capabilities, they maybe have a few fewer big durable units to draw on than some other armies. Talos really aren't too bad, though maybe don't tend to get played as much considering the focus on transports in the Sky Splinter. They certainly can do annoying things on objectives with transports and then units disembarking behind terrain. The damage output can definitely be terrifying, but it maybe can be a little bit swingy depending on the circumstances. It'll drop off a bit after the initial alpha strike outside of transports where they get lance and things. And while their pain tokens can get you some enormous damage buffs, they might occasionally be a bit snowbally, where if you get a few early, you might find it easier to get more. And against some armies, you just might not have as many of them that you can access. Say, for example, if you're fighting against Knights or Custodes with just a few massive units on the other side of the table. For their movement, they do move fast, but at least compared with previous editions of the game, the fly keyword doesn't interact quite in such a godly way with terrain as it did before. Things like their transports, Reavers and Hellions will often have to go around things like tall ruins rather than straight over. For weapons that tend to be effective against them, high rates of volume fire of mid to low AP tend to kill their lighter infantry really quite efficiently, and their light transports tend to not get along very well with things like autocannon equivalents, which might often do more damage to them on average than las cannons. A bit of indirect fire or some extreme fast movers can be bad news as well to hit things like scourges that often tend to get played in competitive lists and tend to rely on remaining safe behind terrain with their jump shoot jump. Maybe for the more underpowered units in the roster at the moment, the Hellions, the Flyers, and maybe the Homunculi and the Grotesque stand out a little bit compared with the rest as undertuned. In general though, I feel like their index has it really quite good with most units being interesting somehow right now. And for other random things, the detachments do feel like they're badly balanced. Sky Splinter just feels like it's got far more use overall than real Space Raiders, unless you really wanted to build an army that was big and focused around pain engines and Talos perhaps. And it maybe is a bit weird that certain Lance platform units can be weirdly more effective in Inari versus Drukhari, gaining access to those battle host rerolls. For the Tyranids, they're on the slightly underpowered side of things at the moment, of win rates around 46%. It does seem that they've been struggling to break their way into the top tables or actually win tournaments since the balanced data slate update. Their current roster of units tends to be fairly inefficient against things that are toughness 10 or higher. Things like spamming Exocrine or Maliceptor shots tend to be some of the better ways to go, though that might only get you so far, and they do tend to be perhaps a little bit better against elite infantry. The Shadow in the Warp can be kind of big for objective things, but might in some games might just literally wind up being essentially a coin flip versus denying an enemy scoring one objective one turn, which while not nothing, is always a bit of a feels bad when your army rule basically does almost nothing in one game. On the flip side, Games Workshop do seem to have built their Synapse web into the army fairly well. Losing Synapse creatures could genuinely make them a lot more prone to battle shock, several of the Tyranid units having a fairly terrible leadership 8 on the outskirts of their army. For the detachments, their balance is okay, I'd say. Assimilation Swarm and Crusher Stampede might struggle a bit versus the rest. Assimilation Swarm mainly just because they don't have many units that can actually have the keyword. For their durability, they've got a fair range of profiles with hordes, mid-infantry, and tougher monsters on the go. Perhaps nothing enormously stands out as they must have against Tyranids. I'd say their durability is kind of mid, maybe not stand out bad, but not really stand out great either. For perhaps some more notable underpowered data sheets, the Swarm Lord and the Psychophage feel like they could both need points cut. I feel like Tyranid Warriors really could go down a bit as well to try and make them a bit more of a central unit as they feel like they should be. And there's certain other things that just seem to be costed into oblivion by GW, things like lone spore mines, spore assists, or the flyers. Another at least fairly common criticism of Tyranid armies is that they've got a bit of an over-reliance on biovores and rippers to essentially auto-complete certain secondaries out there. It often seems to be a talking point on the comments of my videos that if you took that away, Tyranids would really take a tumble down the rankings. I would agree that it feels like a very odd thing for them to be propped up by. For the cultists of the Four-Armed Emperor, we have the Genestealer Cults, kind of in a similar sort of win rate spot to the Tyranids at the moment, around 46%. They did take some pretty massive nerfs since the edition's start with those crazy respawning unit tricks. They tend to be really quite alpha strikey in their gameplay, their units needing to hit very, very hard out of alpha strike and be able to utterly cripple parts of the enemy force, and they do run the risk that if their damage bounces somewhat, they could be in a very bad position, getting hit back hard in return. Their units on the front line will tend to be at least fairly fragile with a bunch of one wound infantry, often right up and close to the enemy. For their core mechanic, those called ambush tokens have some weaknesses. Against a fast moving foe, they could just be deleted by things that deep strike somewhere within 3 inches, or very fast movers that can zip over and take one off the board. Plus they can be really quite swingy now, even for the battle line units, a good chance not to get them back, even if you roll for them in early game. For enemy weapons they don't like, generally anything with mass AP 1, damage 1 to clear out those hordes is going to be good against them. Blasts can be quite strong as well against big ranked up 20-man blocks of neophytes. And for more underwhelming datasheets, the Magus, the Hybrid Metamorphs and the Rock Grinder I feel like are all units that could afford to go down in cost, not really seen quite so commonly on competitive tables. Overall, between all that, they feel like an army that you just need to play with very, very carefully. You can stack some pretty massive damage combos between stratagems, characters, and units like the Achilles Ridge Runner AP debuff, but all of that needs to come together right, and then you need to make sure you apply it at the right place. Lots of big decisions that could be made, some random swings that could unseat your plan, and they do seem to have some unusually bad matchups against certain armies. Orks generally tend to do well against them with mad rush, melee pressure, and a bunch of chopper attacks at AP 1, damage 1. And the Aeldari seem to do well with things like jumping warp spiders able to scrub markers. Plus a lot of their favoured objective skirmishing units are really good against infantry, things like swooping hawks, warp spiders, or maybe shadow spectres. Moving on to 40k Space Dwarves, and the leagues of Votann are currently at least fairly strong in game right now, a win rate around 50%. Their core mechanic is to hand out a bunch of judgment tokens pre-game to the 4 scariest things in the enemy's army, at least at 2000 points, and then potentially acquire more as enemy units destroy yours. Due to the focused nature of those debuffs with a +1 to hit and wound, their damage tends to be far stronger against armies that do just have a few really big units that they can just put those on immediately. When they're hitting on a 4+ and don't get +1 to wounds, their damage output just feels far more anemic. Otherwise, in limitations for their army, they do really have quite a small unit roster at the moment. I'm sure 10th edition will add some extra units for them, including that upcoming infiltrating Hurricane Jaeger unit. But until that point, they do just struggle to fill certain roles with units. For example, they don't really have a very fast melee unit, or an infiltrate unit, or a big indirect fire artillery unit, or anything like that. Just lots of things that some factions can do that they can't. Otherwise, for general trends for them, I'd argue that they just don't really have all that much subtlety beyond raw damage numbers. Maybe in a similar sort of way to Knights, it often means they tend to do okay against the field of other armies, but maybe don't top grand tournaments all that often despite doing okay. And compared with some armies, certainly when they get knocked down and they're on foot and out of transports and things, they won't really be quite so fast moving across the board and tend to be at least fairly short ranged. For enemy weapons, generally higher AP things tend to be quite nice against the leagues of Votann, maybe with damage 2. That can be pretty nasty against their Hearthguard, and given that they can threaten their Void Armor to debuff AP, any things with extremes of AP can be very nice against things like Land Fortresses. I feel like more so than some armies as well, they really don't like either mortal wounds or devastating wounds all that much, getting around their toughness and their saving throws that can be quite good. For units in their roster, I'd say that only really Youthar the Destined really stands out as being a bit weaker than the rest. Perhaps units like the Chthonian Berserks and Hearthkin Warriors feel like they're merely okay. Certainly not unusable, but maybe not going to carry the faction for raw power there. For the Tau Empire, currently they're in the weird limbo state of having their codex released, but not actually having the updated points for it, so it's not officially gone live yet or anything like that. We'll probably have a few weeks to wait for it. Currently they really don't seem to be doing too badly right now though, putting in a solid 52% wins. I'd argue that their internal codex balance is a lot better than many of the other armies in the game, the vast majority of their units being really quite usable, Maybe just a few stick out as truly quite bad, like the Tide Wall fortifications, and the flyers I'd say are a bit underwhelming compared with the on-the-board firepower. For faction weaknesses though, the Tau kind of famously have some areas where they're strong and some where they're not so great. They are almost entirely a dedicated ranged faction with very few melee offerings like Farsight, and I guess those Crutox Rampagers in the new book being so skewed to range versus melee definitely has its downside. Dense tables with loads of line of sight blocking terrain are probably going to hurt the town more than they help them. And having a lot of units that kind of want to keep the foe at arm's length for the most part, it does create a bit of a challenge between how much of the army you choose to push up and play aggressive with. You need to do at least some, otherwise you're not going to score any objectives, but they do have quite a lot of stuff that will quite happily sit and shoot the opponent for a few turns, provided they've got line of sight to do so. Also not really helping with the holding the midboard sort of thing is they don't really tend to have enormously durable units that can just sit on an objective and laugh off all enemy damage. They tend to be more about the firepower and the mobility versus raw tankiness. With their shooting as well, their ballistic skill 4+ that they have built in generally means that they need to make the most of their guiding special rule. If you're not hitting on a 3+, then a lot of their units are going to be kind of sad for damage output. That can mean things can start to get a bit inefficient if, say, you have some key observer units shot down, and even for the units being guided themselves, it can sometimes be a bit of a mixed blessing, given that it makes your split fire a bit worse. So you might have stronger damage output against your primary target, but if you wanted to use some secondary guns to mop up some lighter infantry or something, it's not going to be quite as good. The Tau do have a fair mix of different defensive profiles, everything from horde recruits to mid-strength crisis suits, to tanks, vehicles, and 2+ armor saves. I wouldn't massively rate any one type of firepower to be better than the rest. I guess if you're trying to gun down crisis suit type units, then strength 6 weapons with multi-damage and a bit of AP are alright. That could help out a bit against some of their most iconic units. Next up, we've got the Violent Hordes of the Greenskins. Again, they're doing kind of okay in 40k right now, a solid win rate of 50%, mainly carried by howling masses of Orc melee violence, often jumping out of transport vehicles. Their core index definitely supports melee far more than it does range. Kind of appropriate enough for Orcs, but it is a bit surprising that just how many of their firepower units really are quite inefficient right now. I'd say the only truly scary one is Badrock with flash kits jumping out of a transport. They've got enough scary general purpose firepower to really make things count. Maybe that might be something that gets addressed in the codex when they actually hopefully get some DACA focused attachments. Otherwise, for weaknesses of the army in general, they can struggle against things that are high saves or high toughness or both. Say things like Guard Lehman Rust tanks or Knights on toughness 12 might be hard for Orcs to take down. Lots of their damage comes from volume attacks, some of them at kind of mid-strength like Power Claws, lots with slightly lighter stuff like choppers and things, and they might need to do a whole load of chip damage with things like Beast Snaggers with anti-vehicle, many of which might actually be able to wound the tanks alright, but still also have low AP at like AP1 and things. Can just mean that any big armoured target, the Orcs don't actually have that many options with how to deal with them. Maybe another weakness of their core rule is the War needing to be called at the start of the battle round, which while it's kind of fine if the Orcs are going first, it does mean that if you have to trigger it on your opponent's turn, then they're going to know it's coming and can move to position their units, knowing that you get to advance and charge and are going to be receiving an excess amount of greenskin violence. Generally for enemy weapons they want to look out for anything that's got high strength volume fire, not necessarily with great AP, tends to be good against Orcs. Lethal hits is quite nice as well, and autocannon equivalents do quite well against quite a few of their targets. Otherwise within their army they still feel like they've got some big winners and losers. As I mentioned, most of the DACA units, particularly the buggies and planes, maybe tank busters and looters, and some of the walkers like the Stomper, Death Dread, and the Gorka and Morkanauts. Hopefully the Codex does a little bit to write a bit of balance and have you some interesting ways to play shooty Orcs. Finally, we've got the undead living metal of the Necrons, seeming to be the other army right at the top end of Warhammer 40k right now. Tournament win rates of 56% and certainly a very challenging foe to overcome for many armies out there. They're admittedly really not so crazily far ahead of the pack that they're not beatable by the other factions. They're a far cry from 70-odd win percent Eldar at the start of the edition. Perhaps for the main weaknesses of the Necron datasheets overall are that a lot of units don't tend to be particularly speedy unless they're getting some sort of support to warp round the table, such as in Hypercrypts, and their core mechanic in the reanimation protocols is definitely helpful, though it does feel far less relevant than it was towards the start of the edition when you could get some pretty crazy stacking buffs on units like Lich Guard reanimating. For smaller Necron units out there, you can kind of counter it a bit by focusing down individual squads one by one as opposed to leaving several things damaged. For weapon choice, Necrons do tend to have quite a big range of profiles. For the most part, bar monoliths, quite a lot of things either tend to have sort of mid saves or good invulnerable saves, so AP maybe isn't quite as important against them as some other forces. But in general do have things at a big range of toughness, all the way up from tanky Catan down to little scarabs. Catan are often something that the enemy is going to struggle to take out just for the ridiculous durability that they have. In general, things with a random number of damage or an odd number of damage might do a bit better than even numbers due to them cutting all their enemy damage in half. You don't really want to be shooting damage 2 things against them if you can help it, and weirdly enough, smaller chip damage with damage 1 can still chip in quite a lot. The actual saving throw is kind of mediocre, and you can't half a 1 damage result. Even if realistically due to the high toughness and the feel no pain, it's still only going to do so much. Realistically, I think a lot of the time you're going to be better off trying to ignore as many Catan as possible and focus on the rest of the list and winning the mission. Despite the Necrons having some obscenely powerful stuff, I don't think they're an army that's got particularly good internal balance. There's lots of things that are definitely on the weaker end of the power spectrum, things like Warriors, Triarch Praetorians, Trazen the Infinite, and the Obelisk, to name just a few. And I feel like really quite a lot of their strength is coming from just throwing, say, a Nightbringer and a Void Dragon into an otherwise alright list. If Games Workshop significantly nerfed the Catan, as I feel like is almost certainly coming for them, then the faction's probably going to look a lot more in line with the other armies. For internal balance as well, the detachments certainly aren't really much on a par. The Canoptek Court and the Hypercrypt Legion dominate competitive play. The Awakened Legion is kind of okay, but certainly far lesser played than those ones. In any case, Necrons still are difficult to handle, being one of the strongest factions in the game with the right lists. So anyway, there we have it. With the Xenos talked about, that's just about every faction in Warhammer 40k focused on, and a few of their weaknesses, with army capabilities, underpowered units, and things that might conceivably kill them quite well. Let me know your thoughts about any of the armies talked about down in the comments below. There'll certainly be things that I haven't touched on here, skimmed over, or missed. Look forward to hearing any other weaknesses of your own faction or enemy factions that you've played against down in the comments. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, and if you would like to check out those Starforged people, I'll leave their links down in the video description. A big thank you to them for sponsoring the video. I'll certainly be back for some more Warhammer 40k content over the next day. Finally, if you have been enjoying the videos on Auspex Tactics, then I'd just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep these coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.